tired of being only 3 inches high.
Welcome to the Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Logic of Sense. In each reading, we will be beginning, as much as possible, with the reading itself, followed by an unedited version of the discussion. Be ready for us to take various twists and turns, head down a few rabbit holes ourselves, and try to figure out exactly what's going on with the book. Enjoy. The first important duality was that of causes and effects, of corporeal things and incorporeal events. But insofar as events' effects do not exist outside the propositions which express them, this duality is prolonged in the duality of things and propositions, of bodies and language. This is the source of the alternative which runs through all the works of Carroll, to eat or to speak. In Sylvie and Bruno, the alternative is between bits of things and bits of Shakespeare. At Alice's coronation dinner, you either eat what is presented to you, or you are presented to what you eat. To eat and to be eaten, this is the operational model of bodies, the type of their mixture in depth, their action and passion, and the way in which they coexist within one another. To speak, though, is the movement of the surface, and of ideational attributes or incorporeal events. What is more serious, to speak of food or to eat words? In her alimentary obsessions, Alice is overwhelmed by nightmares of absorbing and being absorbed. She finds that the poems she hears recited are about edible fish. If we then speak of food, how can we avoid speaking in front of the one who is to be served as food? Consider, for example, Alice's blunders in front of the mouse. How can we avoid eating the pudding to which we have been presented? Further still, spoken words may go awry as if they were attracted by the depth of bodies. They may be accompanied by verbal hallucinations, as in the case of maladies where language disorders are accompanied by unrestricted oral behavior. Everything brought to the mouth, eating any object at all, gritting one's teeth. "I'm sure those are not the right words," says Alice, summarizing the fate of the person who speaks of food. To eat words, however, is exactly the opposite. In this case, we raise the operation of bodies up to the surface of language. We bring bodies to the surface as we deprive them of their former depth, even if we place the entire language through this challenge in a situation of risk. This time, the disorders are of the surface. They are lateral and spread out from right to left. Stuttering has replaced the gaffe. The phantasms of the surface have replaced the hallucination of depth. Dreams of accelerated gliding replace the painful nightmare of burial and absorption. The ideal little girl, incorporeal and anorexic, and the ideal little boy, stuttering and left-handed, must disengage themselves from their real, voracious, gluttonous, or blundering images. But this second duality, body language, to eat, to speak, is not sufficient. We have seen that although sense does not exist outside of the proposition which expresses it, it is nevertheless the attribute of states of affairs and not the attribute of the proposition. The event subsists in language, but it happens to things. Things and propositions are less in a situation of radical duality and more on the two sides of a frontier represented by sense. This frontier does not mingle or reunite them, for there is no more monism here than dualism. It is rather something along the line of an articulation of their difference, body language. Comparing the event to a mist rising over the prairie, we could say that this mist rises precisely at the frontier, at the juncture of things and propositions. As a result, the duality is reflected from both sides and in each of the two terms. On the side of the thing, there are physical qualities and real relations which constitute the state of affairs. There are also ideational, logical attributes which indicate incorporeal events. And on the side of the proposition, there are names and adjectives which denote the state of affairs, and also there are verbs which express events or logical attributes. On one hand, there are singular proper names, substantives, and general adjectives which indicate limits, pauses, rests, and presences. On the other, there are verbs, carrying off with them becoming and its train of reversible events and infinitely dividing their present into past and future. Humpty Dumpty forcefully distinguished between two sorts of words. Quote, "They've a temper, some of them, particularly verbs. They're the proudest. Adjectives you can do anything with, but not verbs. However, I can manage the whole lot of them, impenetrably. That's what I say." End quote. And when Humpty Dumpty explains the use of the odd word impenetrability, he provides a much too modest explanation. "I meant that we're had enough of the subject." In fact, impenetrability does mean something else. Humpty Dumpty opposes the impassibility of events to the actions and passions of bodies, the non-consumable nature of sense to the edible nature of things, the impenetrability of incorporeal entities without thickness to the mixtures and reciprocal penetrations of substances, and the resistance of the surface to the softness of the depths. In short, the pride of verbs to the complacency of substantives and adjectives. Impenetrability also means the frontier between the two, and that the person situated on the frontier, precisely as Humpty Dumpty is seated on his narrow wall, has both at his disposal, being the impenetrable master of the articulation of their difference. However, I can manage the whole lot of them. But this is not yet sufficient. Duality's last word is not to be found in this return to the hypothesis of Cratylus. The duality in the proposition is not between two sorts of names, names of stasis and names of becoming, names of substances or qualities and names of events. Rather, it is between two dimensions of the proposition, that is, between denotation and expression, or between the denotation of things and the expression of sense. It is like the two sides of a mirror, only what is on one side has no resemblance to what is on the other. All the rest was as different as possible. To pass to the other side of the mirror is to pass from the relation of denotation to the relation of expression, without pausing at the intermediaries, namely at manifestation and signification. It is to reach a region where language no longer has any relation to that which it denotes, but only to that which it expresses, that is, to sense. This is the final displacement of the duality. It is now moved inside the proposition. The mouse recounts that when the lords proposed to offer the crown to William the Conqueror, the Archbishop of Canterbury found it advisable. "Found what?" asked the duck. "Found it," the mouse replied rather crossly. "Of course you know what it means." "I know what it means well enough. When I find a thing," said the duck, "it's generally a frog or a worm. The question is, what did the Archbishop find?" It is clear that the duck employs and understands it as a denoting term for all things, states of affairs, and possible qualities, an indicator. It specifies even that the denoted thing is essentially something which is, or may be eaten. Everything denoted or capable of denotation is, in principle, consumable and penetrable. Alice remarks elsewhere that she is only able to imagine food, but the mouse made use of it in an entirely different manner, as the sense of an earlier proposition, as the event expressed by the proposition to go and offer the crown to William. The equivocation of it is therefore distributed in accordance with the duality of denotation and expression. The two dimensions of the proposition are organized in two series, which converge asymptotically in a term as ambiguous as it, since they meet one another only at the frontier, which they continuously stretch. One series resumes eating in its own way, while the other extracts the essence of speaking. For this reason, in many of Carroll's poems, one witnesses the autonomous development of two simultaneous dimensions, one referring to denoted objects which are always consumable, or recipients of consumption, the other referring to always expressible beings, or at least to objects which are the bearers of language and sense. These two dimensions converge only in an esoteric word, in a non-identifiable aliquid. Take, for example, the refrain of the Snark. Quote, "They sought it with thimbles, they sought it with care, They pursued it with forks and hope, end quote, where the thimble and fork refer to designated instruments, but hope and care to considerations of sense and events. Sense, in Carroll's works, is often presented as that which one must take care of, the object of a fundamental care. The strange word snark is the frontier which is stretched as it is drawn by both series. Even more typical is the wonderful gardener's song in Sylvie and Bruno. Every stanza puts into play two terms of very different kinds, which offer two distinct readings. Quote, he thought he saw, he looked again and saw it was. Thus the ensemble of stanzas develops two heterogeneous series. One is composed of animals, of beings or objects which either consume or are consumed. They are described by physical qualities, either sensible or sonorous. The other is composed of objects or of eminently symbolic characters defined by logical attributes or sometimes by parental names, and bearers of events, news, messages, or sense. In the conclusion of each verse, the gardener draws a melancholic path, bordered on both sides by both series. For the song, we learn, is its own story. He thought he saw an elephant that practiced on a fife. He looked again and found it was a letter from his wife. At length I realize, he said, the bitterness of life. He thought he saw an albatross that fluttered round the lamp. He looked again and found it was a penny postage stamp. You'd best be getting home, he said. The nights are very damp. He thought he saw an argument that proved he was the Pope. He looked again and found it was a bar of mottled soap. A fact so dread, he faintly said, extinguishes all hope. Okay, so the fourth series of dualities. So at this point, we've now gone a handful of the ways into the first few series, which tend to focus on a little bit of a refreshing of the Stoic conception around bodies and effects, the way that things are and the way that we view them, the sense being generated by them, etc., etc., etc. As we move into the fourth series, this one we had a lot of trouble with last night, I will say. So this was a unique evening. We ended up going off a cliff into a completely different direction around something else because we just couldn't figure out. So I spent the last week trying to figure this out, and then this morning I think a few things came together for me. So like most of ours, I'm going to make some bold hot takes on what these different paragraphs are, and we're going to discuss the things inside of each of them as we try to make our way through what is gratefully a shorter series. It's only a handful of pages, but some really fantastic bits of Carroll I have scattered throughout. So with that, we open up on basically the idea as he starts. The first important duality, which was sort of introduced a bit ago, is that of causes and effects, corporeal things and incorporeal events. He then goes on to talk through the issue is within the proposition, events effects don't exist outside of the propositions that express them. The duality of things and propositions, bodies and language, now becomes the duality we're going to be focusing on through this series. Basically stepping beyond, as I would say it, stepping beyond what a proposition might be pointing at and instead talking about the relations of the elements of the proposition itself, and how the proposition actually relates to things as a duality. Is that a fair take on that sort of beginning of this? This one was a tough one for me, so I apologize if I'm asking very rudimentary things.
I'm not sure if it focuses so much on the proposition. I think it seems to be language as a thing. That was my reading of it.
I think that gives us something to explore then, the relationship of cause and effect, or things and words.
For the moment, up to now, he's looking at language just as composed of propositions. There's no idea of a semantic web or sort of practices amongst the speech community. He seems to use them interchangeably.
True. So it's one of the things he says in here is the phrase that starts out, to eat and to be eaten. This is the operational model of bodies. He doesn't explicitly say it, but it feels like he's also trying to get into sort of the operational model of language, sort of as opposing that as well.
I think he's talking there about how bodies interact with each other. So to be eaten and to eat is a body eats a body, and to be eaten, the body is eaten. And it's their type. It talks about their mixture in depth, their action and passion, and the way in which they coexist with one another. So this is bodies in their interaction. This is what bodies do. They come together in their passions and their depth. But obviously, the away from depth towards surface.
Say that last part again. You cut out slightly. Sorry.
I was going to say the move is so the bodies. This is their operation in depth. So the type of their he said the type of their mixture in depth, their action and passion. But the actual move will be towards the surface. And so later on, he talks about sense as being at the point where they meet, where the body and language meet. So it's all about surface. So I think later on this page, I think he talks about things being on the surface and going from left to right, going across rather than in depth.
There always seems to be an association,
Où est mon chat?
not just a mixture, but a violence in the depths. Sort of an almost Hobbesian war of all against all. When he talks about the little girl and the stuttering left-handed little boy coming to the surface, they have to disengage themselves from their real, voracious, gluttonous, and blundering images. So he's operating with a sort of neutral physicalist description of the bodies and the depths, and a sort of more emotionally toned violence of the depths as well.
Well, so, okay, that's one of the challenges I think I'm having as I read this is understanding, as we talked earlier about sort of surface and depth, I think I've grasped it to this point. When he talks about, though, I'll just say this specific phrase, to eat and to be eaten, this is the operational model of bodies, the type of their mixture in depth, their action and passion, and the way in which they coexist within one another, the actually existing things on that side. To speak, though, is the movement of the surface, ideational attributes, or incorporeal events. He goes on to list a handful of examples that seem extremely playful about showing, as I read it, that it's common knowledge to us. It's like Carroll does, he reverses a lot of things. Sure, we speak of food. This is kind of how that works. But what about eating words? Or what about food that speaks? And the playfulness around that is sort of, I think, as I read it, him bringing out that sort of odd nature that we've made this assumption that, yes, we can speak of food directly, but we can't have food that speaks. We can't eat our words, even though that's because that's an old sort of trope throughout time. The example he uses specifically with Alice, though, of the pudding, where the queen introduces her to pudding, like literally says, "Pudding, Alice, Alice, pudding," and then says, "Remove the pudding," and the pudding runs and like goes away. Oh, mutton, Alice, Alice, mutton, and then says, "You must cut into that, which may I give you a slice?" And it's like this weird thing of sort of treating food as though it's something that can be spoken to, and that you actually have to literally eat words, becomes a the playful nature of that shows the natural sort of dichotomy between the two sides, that there actually isn't a sort of reality that's pointing at, but instead we still have to utilize sort of sense to make a justification around this, is how I understood that. And am I even close?
I think I read the way I read it at the beginning. I think speaking brings it to the surface. So it says speak is the movement of the surface, and the bodies are in depth and speaking at the surface. So speaking of food, i.e. bodies, is to bring it to the surface. And at that point, so things operate at the surface, they don't operate at the depth. So there's a kind of literalness about it again. So, if you're introduced to, you can be introduced through words to food, That's why I'm seeing it. It's a kind of, again, it's this literalness. That's what I think is at play constantly within this is a surface literalness.
Well, that was one of my notes I had, is that this sort of series is about the way, sort of colloquially, I might understand the idea between literal and figurative speech. When I say something, take something literally, take something figuratively, the sort of difference between the two in sort of common parlance and how we talk. So, this one has been very not easy for me. So then I'll ask, the blenders in front of the mouse, for example, Alice, he uses it as an example. He uses all these things as examples, and I can't figure out how to connect them back. Like, their playful natures around playing with the idea of food and eating and how words do those things. I get that, but what is it pointing at? So far, all the three series, the examples have been pointing very cleanly at a thing to sort of notice. And he does it again with Humpty Dumpty. It's very clean. With this, it's she sees the mouse, she doesn't think understands her, so she says, oui, ma chat, which means she thinks the mouse is French for some reason. And lo and behold, the mouse is like, what the fuck, cat? Why would you want to talk about a cat in front of me? That's what eats me. And they have like this back and forth and these gaffes and these sort of fuck ups in that sort of nature. I don't understand how that connects to the point.
I think the structure of the chapter is he's going to go through, the way I count it, 4 dualities, and it's only the last one that's the last duality. So the first one, he just gives a sentence. That's the duality of causes and effects, of corporeal things and of incorporeal events. Then all of this page 25, is the second duality that he's going to transcend later anyhow. So that's the duality of things and propositions, or of bodies and language. And he sort of explains it. And then dealing with the relation between speaking and food, that's in the middle of this page. If we then speak of food, and he talks about the blunders with the mouse, and if we speak of food, somehow that's putting us in the element of food, and there are all these things of dog eats dog, or cat eats mouse, or Alice eats talking pudding. So there's a somber aspect to that. And then quarter of the way down, he considers he's considered, we speak of food, and then he goes to the other side of the duality, and he says to eat words, however, is exactly the opposite. And in that case, we're not going down into the depths, we're raising the operation of bodies up to the surface. And it's like you said before, when you talked about the different oppositions for the different dimensions of the proposition, that we went from true, false, to veracious, mendacious, to sense and nonsense, and so on. And when we come to the surface, the mistakes are no longer the same. It's no longer the gaffe, but it's the stuttering, which he'll explain later in another series. So everything is organized around this provisional second duality of things and propositions, or of bodies and language.
Yeah, I think he says that bodies and language are placed in a situation of risk. I think that's an important phrase. And the disorders, as he says, are of the surface. So everything's being brought to surface constantly here in this series. And there's lateral and spread out. As Terence said, stuttering replaces the gaffe. So that is the disorder of speech. A stutter is a disorder of speech, whereas a gaffe is just something wrong, you've said something out of place. So it's not a disorder, it's just a bad use of language or whatever. So this is the disorder of speech. That's the significance of disorder, I would say that. And the phantasms of the surface place, hallucinations of depth. So phantasms is something that appears like something, but isn't that. Whereas the hallucination is something that you think is there, but it isn't there. So it's this kind of, it's had it in the previous series, this sort of, this planar, this planar attribute he talks about, which is obviously central to Deleuze's whole work as well. So he talks about the accelerated gliding.
Right. But still, he's mentioning that speech is something that is dealing with these ideal attributes or unbodily events. So by attributing qualities with language, there is some sort of, as Terence mentioned, some violence placed or done to the bodies that are constantly mixing, consuming each other. And in language, we are dealing with most of the time with fixed connotations, like with pudding. When we get introduced to pudding, we see it as an entity. We have a fixed meaning of it. We see the pudding only as something that can be eaten, because it is the typical tradition of using this word. So there's this conflict then. We are then seeing something as a person through a different use of language. So there's a disturbance. And through this, a phantasm could be something that is outside of the unconventional use of language, and makes clear this duality, that language is rather a virtual aspect that is not dealing with the entities, so to speak, or these operations of a very dynamical nature of constantly consuming and assimilating and creating new structures and forms. That is through these paradoxes of phantasms, this duality gets pointed out, and we see this gap between language and the bodies.
Also, when he talks about to eat words, his discussion there, that for me refers back to the paradox of Chrysippus, when he said, if we say the word chariot, a chariot passes between our lips. Well, this time it's not eating, but there's the idea that it's true, but it's not the body causal chariot. It's the like for the boy and the little girl, it's the incorporeal double, the noematic chariot that does pass through our lips on this side of the duality.
And at the end of that paragraph, he talks about the ideal little girl and the ideal little boy. So there's this kind of reference to ideality, which is in both of these. This is how they appear in their depth, shall we say, the ideal little girl who's Alice, obviously incorporeal, anorexic, and the ideal little boy, stuttering left-handed, who is Carroll himself, must disengage them from their real, voracious, gluttonous, and blundering images. So this is the kind of ideal, as opposed to the real. Interesting to use the word images there, though. I'm interested why you should use that as a term, but
I would say it's maybe because he's reading or he has read Bergson, and for Bergson the image is pretty significant in this sense, because in his philosophy, especially in matter and memory, there is the image as something that is mediating between the body and or better, that is enabling our actions, because we are constantly interacting with images. So it is to maybe reduce it to a very vague understanding of Bergson, this virtual plane we're interacting with. And here we ascribe these images that are some sort of coherent constellations with some sort of significance for us in relation to us, to something else, like to a person with specific attributes that we are pointing out. We don't see the real person with all its complexities and these bodily consumptions, but we just ascribe a ideal surface image of them that we interact then with, like with the poor child that has no other qualities to it than being poor and not having, for example, dreams or some talents in a specific field.
Yeah, and I kind of feel that the reference to voracious, gluttonous, and blundering is the risk, is the bodies, is themselves at risk. So the ideal is them anorexic or stuttering, whereas the voracious are these sort of like the stutter. Well, perhaps not. I don't know. Perhaps I'm not sure. Perhaps I'm wrong there. But I'm just wondering if that's a kind of risk thing, the actuality of it. But perhaps not.
Also, I think the images are a reference back to the last chapter where denotation, which is a referential aspect of language talking about bodies. Denotation, he begins with that in the third series, and associates it with images that are to be selected out as representing or not. Denotation functions through page 13. Denotation functions through the association of the words themselves with particular images which ought to represent the state of affairs. So that's where he talks within this book, but it's true. It's a synthetic book that brings in to play all that is done with Bergson and Spinoza and so on. So Triad's explanation is the most general, but just on the specific unfolding of the text, it's taking up again what he says about denotation in the chapter just before.
I was just going to say that I think that the issue, I do agree with Triad about the sort of subtle Bergson nod there, but I think the issue is that we don't want to fall into this, although he's using different notions of the word image, at least for Bergson, the image, we don't want to talk about it in a representational kind of way. And then I think the reason it fits with that Bergsonian notion is because he says bodies, the mixture of all bodies and things kind of all simultaneously acting on each other at the same time in the world, in a sense, in the states of affairs. That corresponds to how Bergson talks about images far beyond any kind of idea of representation. Image is almost the same thing as body, but I like this framing, the way Deleuze is kind of playfully talking about them as gluttonous, like as though bodies left on their own, if that were even possible, but left on their own, are essentially doomed to endlessly combine and, affect each other and kind of collapse upon each other because they're just parts of the states of affairs, and that this is the gap, the risk and the gap comes more from when this is put into play with other theories or with other things, I guess. So that's just what I wanted to mention.
I think that feels more spot on to me. When we move into his what he says, the second duality, that of body, language, and eat and speak, he then goes into that the events actually subsist in language, but happens to things. Things and propositions are less in a situation of radical duality and more on two sides of a frontier represented by sense. But he then also goes on to say that this frontier, this gap, does not mingle or reunite them. It's not that it brings together these two sides into like a new cohesive whole, but it's specifically, he calls it an articulation of their difference. It basically the space that causes them to be body and language, sort of the power that makes them connected and on opposite sides. So I think just to follow up what you were saying, Alyosha, I think it's the gap is. He goes pretty heavily into that in this second paragraph for sure, sort of talking about that gap as this thing that allows these sort of two sides to exist. Physical qualities, real relations, the duality reflected from both sides. Like this sort of nature of things sort of follows from what you were saying, I think.
Yeah, I suppose this is also, well, we'll see, this chapter kind of talks a lot about the idea of division and what kind of duality are we talking about? If denotation, manifestation, and signification all kind of lead to each other and none of them can be thought of as a ground. And in fact, inside of the proposition itself, for example, there is its own duality of denotation and expression. If sense is always that fourth aspect to all of the other things, then we're dealing with a completely different, that's why I think the essay at the end is really helpful, because it's not about resemblance or correspondence between things. It's about, even within the proposition itself, like he'll say in this chapter, the mirror, it's as though the two sides of the mirror are completely different, and there's an image without resemblance that leads us back. That's the simulacrum. So that that image without resemblance, that is at the heart of the proposition, or of all these most kinds of statements, I guess, isn't a degraded copy. It's not something that is inferior or anything. It's that gap, or that a possibility of there being a slippage between those things. He uses many different words for it: on the frontier, the impenetrable frontier, or whatever it is. It's in this space where things, but where sense becomes possible, sort of like almost all at once. And I think I was saying last night that this section, the second paragraph, was really helpful for me, because I don't know if he's quite articulating it this way yet, but it's as though, like Triad said, we're getting into a notion of the virtual as well, because for something to not exist but still be the attribute of a state of affairs, I think we're talking about, how things become actual. Um, but anyway, yeah, I think we'll be getting to some of this stuff in the coming paragraphs.
So, just to take this back to the first series, when he talks about how the duality, by my count, that's the third duality. He's made reference, one, to the wrong duality of the dogmatic image of thought, causes and effects. Then on the 25, he's talked about how this duality is prolonged, the effect revised in the duality of things and propositions, bodies and languages. And then this third one, which is because he says this second duality, body language, to eat to speak is not sufficient. So he needs a third one. And this third one is a callback, at least in the second part of it. The first part is the duality is reflected in physical qualities and real relations, and vis-a-vis ideation or logical attributes. That's the physical side of physical duality. And the linguistic side, which is double as well, is the names and adjectives which denote the state of affairs, and the verbs which express events or logical attributes. That's the hypothesis of the Cratylus that he evokes on page 2, only to decide that this 2 is insufficient.
Well, and this one's an interesting one because, so it's because that's also how I read it. That there's this new duality, and one is basically it's between the sentence said on the side of the proposition. You have the names, the verbs, pauses, limits, rests, presences, verbs expressing events on that side, but on the other side is the state of affairs. So it's things versus the words we use about them, essentially, as the two sort of sides of this one. To not to oversimplify, but it feels like that's. So his point is like, hey, so when we have a conversation and we're actually having these conversations, it's sort of the things and states of affairs on one side, propositions on the other, and he's just further breaking that down. He's just further breaking it down with specificity, it feels like, and sort of continuing to show that first duality, the sort of original one between sort of incorporeal and corporeal things, and how it's sort of inserting and pushing itself further into the actual proposition itself, and how proposition is sort of built up.
I think we think duality as being mutually exclusive, but I think he's trying to get beyond that. So the language and bodies do have this. They do have their own individual being, should we call it? But they're kind of united by sense. So this is the thing that brings them together. And going on to page 27, he said basically it moves in, the relationship between the two moves into the proposition. And I think that's my feeling about this, because I think the return to the hypothesis of Cratylus, my understanding of that is that the notion of a name is kind of, the name is the thing. So if you give a name, if you say a name, then you're saying the thing. Whereas, so he says duality in proposition is not between two sorts of names, between two dimensions of the proposition, denotation and expression. So it's the two things, how they're united in one thing. Again, it's this duality of bringing together. Because, like I say, I think we kind of we normally think of duality as being two opposites. You know, the two each excludes the other. Whereas I think in this analysis, the two are brought together. They keep their individual kind of identity, but they're brought together at the surface through sense. That's the thing that is at the frontier that kind of brings them together.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. It's almost a symbiotic relationship between the two. It's not necessarily oppositional. Well, it is. It's also oppositional. He talks earlier about the reality of sort of overfavoring one versus the other, and actually goes on of his way to say that there are disorders that come to the surface, and if we favor, like, if we move that which is eaten into the word of language, if we move bodies into language too much, that fucks us up. Other way fucks us up too. So it's almost like they are they're symbiotic, not necessarily really oppositional, but that they play together in a way that is really unique and necessitates that glue that sense has. It's almost like they produce the glue that actually keeps them together, which is interesting.
Yeah, I think on page, again, that end of that first paragraph on page 27, he kind of says that. He says it's to reach a region where language no longer has any relation to that which it denotes. So it's no longer denotes, but only to that which it expresses. That is to sense. So this language is the sense. This is language's sense rather than denotation. And he says it's the final displacement of the duality. It's now moved inside, so it's displaced into the proposition. And the next paragraph, I think, develops that idea further.
So I'm not super familiar with Cratylus. I took a crack, not a thing that you could read in a short sitting. I mean, it's okay. It's just didn't connect with me a lot. When he says to pass on the other side of the mirror is to pass from the relation of denotation to the relation of expression, sort of putting denotation again as a duality on one side, but also within the proposition, with expressions on the other side, also still within the proposition. One denoting things, the other essentially expressing sense. The phrase that he uses here is that what is on one side has no resemblance to what is on the other, which is a confusing phrasing for me, because if they are symbiotic in general and how they're sort of speaking, and sense sort of is gluing them, how do they not have any resemblance to each other? Like, what is it? What is the thing that he's speaking at here very specifically?
I guess he's just destroying this, or not destroying, but he's skeptical of this relationship we take for granted, that it is not this two sides of the mirrors, as he says, of the sentence and the denotated object, like these are the two faces or the two sides of the mirror, but he wants to go behind the mirror. He breaks this relationship between denoting an object and the object that is resembled, and it gets this side view of a mirror, or almost this expression of just expressing words without this practical use, in a very aesthetic sense, almost the production of sense in a pure form without the denotating aspect.
Yeah, do you mind if I
It's
just
almost
read
like
this little
making-
quote from the... Oh,
Go ahead.
no, go ahead, Terence.
Just a little verbal remark. It's almost like resemblance is becoming a technical term, because in a certain sense there's a resemblance, because he talks about the boy and the girl having an incorporeal double. So resemblance is reserved for the way bodies resemble each other, and then there's a correlate in the on the surface that you need another word for, because it has totally different properties and relations. So that's the double, the doubling, and not the resembling. So that's...
I was just going to read this bit from the Plato and Simulacrum essay that I thought was helpful. He says, let us consider the two formulas. Only that which resembles differs, and only differences can resemble each other. These are two distinct readings of the world. One invites us to think difference from the standpoint of a previous similitude or identity, whereas the other invites us to think similitude and even identity as the product of a deep disparity. The first reading precisely defines the world of copies or representations. It posits the world as icon. The second, contrary to the first, defines the world of simulacra. It posits the world itself as phantasm. From the point of view of the second formula, therefore, it matters little whether the original disparity upon which the simulacrum is built is great or small. It may happen that the basic series have only a slight difference between them. It suffices that the constitutive disparity be judged in itself, not prejudging any previous identity, and that the disparate be the unity of measure and communication. Resemblance then can be thought only as the product of this internal difference. It matters little whether the system has great external and slight internal difference, or whether the opposite is the case. provided that the resemblance be produced on a curve, and that difference, whether great or small, always occupy the center of the thus decentered system. I don't know if it helps a lot, Brooks, but I think that he's trying to get outside of this idea that the language normally operates by this kind of, this Platonic thing he's describing of like you have the things corresponding. There's the idea, and there's the same, and then there's the similar, which tries to correspond to the idea or fails to, and is a copy. And there's legitimate copies and false copies and all this stuff. And he's saying that if there isn't actually a one-to-one correspondence there, then yeah, that if there's a gap of meaning or a gap or a divergence where they don't exactly touch, then yeah, I mean, the way I understand it is that, the difference itself, the second sentence, only differences can resemble each other. Like what appears to be resemblance in a kind of common sense understanding of language, or even a formal system like a Platonic system, that is actually an effect of a differential process that precedes it, I guess. Maybe that's word soup, but
no,
I wonder
it's,
if that...
it's so the last 2 pages of this where he's talking about, the duck and the mouse having a discussion around it as an example, or the sort of stanzas from Sylvia and Bruno. And he talks about the mirror. So one of the things he's done here also is he's sort of removed from this conversation, because he's saying that on the one hand, within the proposition, you have the thing, and then on the other hand, you have the sense of things, whatever, you have the expression. That sort of skips the manifesting, and it skips signification, which is unique. And it seems to be that's when we have these conversations, we're reading through his examples, for example, when it's the pudding that you have to be introduced to, there's like on its face, there's the signification there's all fucked up. Like that's the joke, is it kind of plays with that. Otherwise it's the it between the duck and the mouse. Signification is broken because there's no sort of common understanding of it, but at the same time, it's kind of like who is saying it. The manifestation is also broken, and that's where the sort of humor comes from. Who's on first, who's on second, who's on first, what's on second, I don't know, is on third kind of moment, where it's what are we talking about? Doesn't matter. The signification's broken. Who's saying it? Very much we kind of have that as a joke, so we're able to pass essentially from one to the other, and that being sort of the two sides allows us to see sort of that duality. And he brings it up, it feels like in the Snark, as kind of the perfect example of one that both completely breaks manifesting and signification. Am I even close with that?
I think it's right, because on the denotation side, resemblance is going to be organized by signification. That's the whole thing, how denotation depends on signification. Otherwise, you don't know what you're talking about, so you can't select out the real things in the world. And resemblance there is dependent on signification. It's grouping together things with the same pre-constituted properties or relations. And resemblance, he's dividing resemblance in two. Resemblance on the surface side is in the quote that was just read is an effect produced by difference. So it's not grouping together things under predefined qualities. And of course, it's two incommensurable worlds. Resemblance doesn't mean the same thing in the body side as it does in the event side. And so he's disallowing a third sense of resemblance, where you could say the things on one side resemble the events on the surface, or the other way around.
Yeah, I think it's worth looking at the excuse me, the example that Deleuze gives from Lewis Carroll, where, like I say, he's focusing on the sense of what's being said. So, and it's the sense of the word "it." What does the word "it" mean? So, the Archbishop of Canterbury found it advisable. Found what? Found it the mouse. So, of course, you know what it means, and for the duck, the it means food, and it's this body, it's this kind of image that's been developed throughout, this notion that the food is representation of the body, so it can be eaten, or it can eat, or can be eaten. So in this state where the sense moves inside into the proposition, so in other words, what's being said, so the sense is mobile. It's the word "it" then takes on a really important place within that statement. And it's completely immediately open to question, because it's lost its denotation. It doesn't refer to anything. It has no reference. And the duck knows what it means for him, but what does it mean for the Archbishop of Canterbury?
Yes, maybe we need another word for the second use of it. The first use of it is referential or denotative. It refers to something precedingly mentioned or visible to everyone or perceivable to everyone in the context. That's the sort of pronoun, referential pronoun. Then it, as a linguistic marker, it is under the regime of anaphora. It refers, but not in the referential sense of designating something in the world. It refers back, or cataphora ahead, to a proposition.
Yeah, I think Deleuze actually clarifies this use of the word "it," and he said it has a duality itself. Within this quote, it has a duality between denotation, so it denotes the advisability of offering the crown to winning the conqueror, but it also it's the expression. It has this expression of something that can be eaten.
I don't think it denotes the advisability, or denotation is what is a body in the world that can be eaten. An expression has subsets like anaphora, where a pronoun refers to a proposition.
It's almost a reference to a previous signification.
Yes.
Because it's a callback to, at some point, at some point the mouse said the crown, accepting the crown is a good idea, which is essentially a series of significations and the relation between them. This is him using it. I'm assuming it's a male mouse. Sorry, shouldn't assume gender of mice. The mouse sits there and goes, well, it's a good thing, referring back to that signification, but it itself in this space is basically pure sense in this specific proposition, because it presumes the sense of the previous proposition that is already understood. And the duck doesn't have that. The duck is playing effectively the game of skipping signification, skipping manifestation, and going straight from bodies to effect, bodies to sense, and saying, well, yeah, I know what it means. It is food. I love it. I eat it all the time. It's like, no, dude, that's not what it means. So it's because to him, and again, I keep going back to Deleuze's sort of difference in repetition paragraphs on good sense and common sense and all of that. But like, it's a play on the idea that there is even an understanding of sort of the common sense between things and references between, large scales of stuff and how we have that work. Here for the duck, his context, his signification is just how he's always used it. He doesn't he doesn't really care that the mouse, in a previous conversation, not very long ago, actually, in the book, made the statement that he's referring to and utilized signification and manifestation to attach those things. And then the mouse is continuing to use the sense that was generated by that proposition at this point. And the duck's just on his way, like, fuck, I'm hungry, or something. It's an interesting, really, really good example. I really like that one.
And I think we should.
And we find the beginning of anti-Oedipus. Sorry.
Yeah, I think we should notice as well that the quote Deleuze describes a quote as a series, and what he's writing is a series. So this is the fourth in a series. So within that one quotation, there is a series which one thing connects to another. Sorry, Terence.
I was looking forward to the famous beginning of Anti-Oedipus, which begins with it. It is at work everywhere. And there's the ambiguity there between it as designating partial objects and subjects of the verbs, and it as a sort of impersonal marker to just give the verb its full liberty. It eats, it fucks.
It eats, it fucks, it shits, all of that stuff.
It shits. Sorry, I was repressing shitty. And you've sort of got both uses of it brought into play to get rid of the it, which is a single-minded denotation, and is getting drawn over towards the verb, the process aspect straight away.
Well, I loved, I think it was Lou, I want to say. It was Lou or Triad, one of you two, who brought up the fact that in that sentence, because we were having a discussion about it when we were doing our rereading, in that sentence where it starts, it is this sort of odd, what are they referring to with it, but then the sentence, what a mistake to have ever said the id. And id sort of originally was just it in a number of languages. It is sort of an odd sort of bastardization of it. And so having that thing where you're like, I don't want to like jump too far into Anti-Oedipus, but you're reading it and then you go, oh, that's what that was, which may have other callbacks inside of this book and inside of AO. I kind of thought was really clever. Now, obviously, it takes on a secondary meaning as well. I hadn't connected those, that's great.
Say the it as denotation. If you say it with all these verbs, eating, fucking, shitting, it's on the expressive side.
And it's sentences, because they're so short, each one of those, there is no manifesting, there is no signification. It eats, it shits, it fucks, is a skipping through the mirror, basically.
Yes, the verbs are taking over.
I think this section as well, like when he's explaining the mouse passage, this is where he says, I think he's hinting at this stuff he's going to develop later about the correspondence of the two series and how they always one kind of has to exceed the other always in order to allow for this productive gap to exist. Because he says that the two dimensions of the proposition are organized in two series which converge asymptotically in a term as ambiguous as it, since they meet one another only at the frontier which they continuously stretch. And then one series resumes eating in its own way while the other extracts the essence of speaking. So there's a way, like, again, this idea that while they kind of approach each other, there's this idea, and I kind of pasted that quote as well from the Simulacrum essay, that in order for sense to flash across the two series and allow for meaning to be felt or intuited or understood in the first place, they can't actually coincide. The idea that they would coincide and perfectly sort of correspond to each other is, I guess, just a false notion. This is why he's interested in reversing Platonism, so-called, and rereading Nietzsche and all that. But just the asymptote cold circle was actually very helpful for me yesterday in explaining what an asymptote is, which I didn't know. And it recalls the kinds of problems that again, to bring up Bergson, it almost recalls a kind of Zeno's paradox that relates to notions of movement and time as well, of these two lines that never quite converge, and that the further you zoom in and the further you subdivide and try and separate them or analyze where they are, you'll find that they, as much as it looks like they converge from a certain perspective, if you keep zooming in and zooming in, they never quite collide. But that's not a negativity, it's a productive, I think he calls it a positive power in the simulacrum essay, of the simulacrum. So the simulacrum as the model for meaning rather than as a perversion of meaning. I think it's all being set up here.
Yeah, I think so I think you're right what you say. So the two meanings are kept separate. So the excuse me, one is in terms of denotation and expression. But then he goes on the next page, on page 228. He said the two dimensions do converge, but only in what he calls an esoteric word, in a non-identifiable aliquid. And this word aliquid we've had a number of times in the previous series that we've looked at, and Deleuze it's translated as something, as it means something. But my understanding is that it's something that is not mixable. It can't be mixed with something, and I think that's literally the way I read it. So a liquid, not liquid. So I think, and then he gives an example of the word. The snark is a example of this, a liquid.
I would agree with that. I think the way he specifically uses a liquid sort of throughout this is definitely in that sense of it is a something, but a something that effectively stands alone. Like there's no, which is interesting, because then it definitely is in a unique place, because you have bodies and effects both on sort of opposing sides that do mix and do interplay, and that's why it's like it only converges in an esoteric word. And the use of the snark here is wonderful for that.
Yeah, and it's pointing towards the meaning, the sense of something being what is on the surface meaningless or strange, and yet there is a sense to it which is coming out, which here is, as he says, is perhaps the idea of the snark, the word snark.
Just a couple of remarks on language again. When the translator says the two series which converge asymptotically, in French, well, it's correct. It's mathematically, maybe that's the accepted translation, but in French it's which converge à l'infini, which converge at infinity or to infinity. And I like Derek's reading of aliquid, but it's also a Latin word which means something, and for me that corresponds on the noun side to the use of the infinitive. The infinitive is the verb in its pure non-embodied, literally non-embodied state, not embodied in the bodies and the causal relations. And aliquid is that which is put forward by the Stoics as the name for in a certain way, even though you can't have a subject for the infinitive, maybe it's the noun that has none of the predicates and properties of the corporeal depths.
The final example he gives of the gardener's songs in Sylvian Bruno, they call him the Mad Gardener, I believe. I haven't reread Sylvian Bruno recently, but and he throughout the book has random moments and sort of sings his own songs about what's happening in front of him. It's very strange, but the way that it works, the way Deleuze describes it here is the ensemble of stanzas develops two heterogeneous series. One is composed of animals, beings, or objects which consume or be consumed. They are described by physical qualities, sensible or sonorous, and the other is composed of objects or of eminently symbolic characters defined by logical attributes or sometimes parental names, bearers of events, news, message, or sense. In the conclusion of each verse, the gardener, every one of these is ultimately a melancholic response at the very end of it. It's an interesting selection he gives of a handful of these, but there are a few others that are really great. I'll post into the chat as well. He thought he saw a coach and four that stood beside his bed. He looked again and found it was a bear without a head. Poor thing, he said, poor silly thing, it's waiting to be fed. The absolute separation throughout all of these stanzas of what they mean, what he sees, what the reality is, and then him sort of in between and parsing the meaning between them and what they sort of conclude. It's an interesting way for him to end this setup, I thought.
There's a mistake in the translation. Sometimes it's just things you can discuss about, but in the end of the paragraph that you were reading, the gardener draws a melancholic path, bordered on both sides by both series. For this song we learn is, in my translation it says, is its own story, which doesn't make sense. It is his own story. In French, the son histoire it could refer, it's not technically wrong, it could refer back to story or refer forward to story, but it makes more sense, and it's linguistically correct to say, because that's how the verses are constructed. It's his own story. That's why it's melancholic.
Well, and that actually really, that makes a lot more sense, because even when they take place in the book, the way that they sort of come about is he's the mad gardener, and he's just like talking about someone. Who the fuck is he talking about? You don't know. He's manifesting himself, you see, in retrospect. But you only learn that sort of as he finishes and as he goes through it. The first one I think I realized, if I go back, it was the garden door. I'll read it. He thought he saw a garden door that opened with a key. Literally, he's standing in front of a garden door and he's leaving. He looked again and found it was a double rule of 3. And it's all a mystery, he said. It's clear as day to me. And then he walks through the door and wanders off. So it's the first time kind of it becomes clear that he's talking about himself, and these things become nonsense outside of that, but they work very cleanly within the story almost. It's intentionally ambiguous for sure, Alyosha, but it's very clear that he's talking about his own thoughts, and that's the part that's really fun about these sort of sections inside of it.
So there's actually a puzzle within the gardener's song. Here's in the preface to Sylvie and Bruno Concluded. The other puzzle, which I set about in Volume 1, was to determine which, if any, of the 8 stanzas of the gardener's song were adapted to the context, and which, if any, had the context adapted to them. The last of them is the only one that was adapted to the context, the garden door that opened with a key, having been substituted for some creature that nestled in a tree. At stanzas 2, 5, and 7, the context was adopted to the stanza. At stanza 4, neither stanza nor context was altered. The connection between them was simply a piece of good luck.
Well, that makes me feel like I'm more clever than I thought then, because that's fantastic.
Yeah, okay, I'll type that out. Give me a minute.
Some of them are pretty great. He thought he saw a banker's clerk descending from the bus. He looked again and found it was a hippopotamus. If this should stay to dine, he said, there won't be much for us. fucking go read this whole book again now, making me smile. But again, it's the final sentence is about these things. In conclusion of each verse, the gardener draws a melancholic past, bordered on both sides by both series. For this song we learn is his story from, like, it's, again, just to go back, it feels like a lot of what he's talking about here is skipping from the thing to sense directly, like straight across, without going through manifestation or signification. And it's a really sort of fun place to play, but it does show sort of this underlying nature of how propositions work and play. I think I'm starting to grasp this better, at least a little bit.
And in each case, in each verse, there's no resemblance between the two things.
Yeah, there's no connective, signification is being skipped because there's literally no way to see how things are related inside of any of these. And it's only during the one with the garden door because he happens to be standing at a garden door that opens with a key. And then he says those final words as he sort of walks off. And it's it's a very Carolian line that he has there that says, it's all it's a mystery, he said. It's clear as day to me. It's a wonderful sort of turn of phrase, very, Alice in Wonderland and Lewis Carroll sort of style, which I really like.
One thing that occurred to us or to me last night that we were talking about, I don't know if this is helpful or if it's slightly, tangential, but I thought one of the reasons this stuff is so hard to grasp, especially in your waking life, is because, it's working on these paradoxes and we're used to thinking and speaking in a particular way. But, there's a reason why we talk about, it's like Alice in dreamland, in a sense, through the looking glass into the other side of the mirror. And I thought one helpful way, at least for me, again, crudely, to kind of perform this operation in my head was to think about dreams themselves, in a context where you can have all kinds of images in a representational sense. You can have all kinds of expressions, denotations, things happening. And the point isn't simply that they don't mean anything, right? Like, you can come away from a very nonsensical experience with a very profound sense that something was communicated to you, whether it's from your own unconscious or whatever it might be. The point is that rather than taking a strictly psychoanalytic approach that everything in the dream actually secretly corresponds or represents something else, is that actually the reasons why dreams can be so profound, in one possible reading that I'm just proposing, is that it's precisely because, like in waking life, when we do it in fiction and in art and in dreamland, like, you're able to de-link, denude some of those things that we take for granted and allow for a full, those inclusive disjunctions we might call, of like a full play with sense, where things that don't seem to actually make any sense follow. You're able to sort of take directions from things in a dream. At least for myself, I dream quite vividly, like that shouldn't make any sense. Somebody makes a statement that corresponds not at all to what you then do, but you understood something from that thing. So I don't know if it helps, but for me, it kind of helped thinking again of like this idea of the simulacrum of image without a resemblance being something that isn't about a lack of meaning, but is actually the more that you allow that pure simulacrum to take hold, you actually, it's very anti-Oedipus in a way. You can see the kind of presaging of Indus, because you have a surfeit of meaning rather than an absence of meaning. You have like almost an overproduction of meanings in every direction. And I found that helpful for me to understand this.
That phrasing you said last night, I think, and you just said it again, the production of meaning of sense, I think is what has been helping me to grasp this and be able to connect it, because it does feel like we're very clearly talking about effectively the machinic nature of propositions and how they produce sense. He says it fairly clearly a couple times even. That's great. We have a bunch of people in the room. Does anyone have? We've sort of gone through all of this. Does anyone have questions, or are they having trouble with any parts before I start saying where I continue to have questions or things I want to sort of pick at a little bit from the reading? Does anyone have anything? Now would be the time.
I have just a very vague question. Terence, you were mentioning something about sense being a new aspect for Deleuze, or a new quality, so to speak, if I remember correctly. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Could you explain what I said? Because I don't understand.
I guess it's something you mentioned not only in this reading, but a few weeks earlier, together with Kant, that sense is something not merely a logical category for Deleuze, but something very profound that we have to elaborate more, and that we have to understand in a very broad sense, and to unfold this whole idea of sense in Deleuze, and especially in Logic of Sense. But
I'm
if you
not sure of the
cannot
context.
answer this ad hoc, it's no problem.
There's the aspect that it implies a different logic. There's the aspect that came up in our first dialogue, that Deleuze talks about it as a surface, but once you go inside, it's no longer a flat surface in the ordinary sense. It is missing the vertical dimension, which is the foundational dimension, but it's what Deleuze later calls, he calls it a plane, but a n-dimensional plane, or to show that it's flat in the sense it has no foundational dimension, he calls it an n-1 dimensional plane. So it's from the outside, from the heights or from the depths, it looks like a plane, which may be a simple structure to explore, but once you go inside, it's an n-1 dimensional space, and so it's got lots of things to explore, including a different logic. Could it be that? Or is it you thinking of something else?
No, I guess it was going in this direction, and I really try to wrap my head around it.
The third aspect that I might have discussed is the idea that sense, as we're seeing with the infinitive and the aliquid, the something, that sense is somehow generic without being general. And that's the way that sense is linked to, that's why it has this unstable dimension to it. It can belong to many different significations. And that sense is the gateway between paradigms, that is to say, between different webs of signification, that if you're operating in terms of the sense, you can communicate even though the paradigms are incommensurable and you shouldn't be able to communicate. And that can be part of the formula for creating new thoughts. They're the three main things that come to mind.
Oh, okay. So that sense is like somewhat autonomous structure that is still very flexible, like a very flexible web or schema that you can use and stretch in different ways, and that is not as dogmatic as a whole theoretical framework, for example, or a typical way of using words in a very stiff structuralist way.
Yes, that's the fourth duality in the chapter. The third duality is the duality of the Cratylus, where you have names of stasis and names of becoming. The names of stasis are the nouns and the adjectives. The names of becoming are the verbs. But that's not the last word. The last word is that it's not two different names, two different sorts of names, but two different dimensions in all of language. So in every name. So in every name, there'll be the stasis aspect and the becoming aspect. And for me, the stasis aspect is what draws on the side of signification, and the becoming aspect is what draws on the side of transformation, of including transformation of signification. So that's the speech act side as well.
All right. Did that work out, Triad? I wasn't able to follow most of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh no.
No, it's okay. It's my brain is just apparently in a lower gear than I expected today. It's the way it works sometimes.
Did I make sense, Triad?
He said
Yeah,
yes.
I could follow
he said
you.
yes.
So
I'll go with Triad. That's what matters. Yeah, I'm not the person to be the moderator of whether or not a thing makes sense. That's not where I belong. I'm on the wrong side of the fucking mirror, apparently. Actually, so I'm going to ask, is there anything more? Because I think actually we've covered everything within this series pretty heavily. It's luckily a shorter one, and we're moving on to a sort of larger one next week. But anything? Oh yes.
Yeah, I think Alyosha noticed a sort of like intertextual, or not intertextual, but sort of like
The thing we missed.
intratextual callback to chapter 2 with the mist on the surface.
What's missed, and we've also missed talking. Let's talk about the mist on the surface. Let's have that conversation because this is brought up inside of this. Sorry, pardon me. Comparing the event to a mist rising over the prairie, we could say that this mist rises precisely at the frontier, at the juncture of things and proposition. As a result, the duality is reflected from both sides and in each of the two terms. Why does he use the term like a mist rising from the prairie here? Real question, not fucking around.
I think it's to evoke a topology, right? So that the topology of surface, and rather than the depth that we were talking about before, and then the mist, because it's not something that you can easily capture or denote simplistically,
And it rises from the surface.
and it rises, so it's as though it's produced, or in order to be seen and understood, it has to be in contrast to something, right? But I think this quote, I don't actually know what it's from, but it's from an article on virtuality in Bergson and Deleuze. But I'll try and find the source. But it's from Dialogues, okay, where Deleuze says philosophy is the theory of multiplicities. Every multiplicity implies actual elements and virtual elements. There is no purely actual object. Every actuality surrounds itself with a fog of virtual images. I thought that was a nice kind of synchronicity there, but it's a discussion for another time. But I think it kind of shows how Deleuze's understanding, even when he's using Bergson and things like this, of the virtual is different and is his own. Anyway, just that there's, I won't go into that. I just think it's a good correspondence.
I think that with Deleuze, I think there is a relationship to geography which is quite powerful. So one of his essays is called Desert Islands, if I remember correctly, and I think there is this interest in the kind of landscape. I'm trying to think about a word than landscape, but so he gives an example. So when talking about the schema in Kant, he talks about the animal going through the landscape and leaving a path. So I think these images are kind of quite important for Deleuze in the way he develops his thinking throughout his work.
Definitely. I think interesting.
And he's always very careful. He always repeats the same expressions. So it's not a mist. It's always a mist over the prairie, a mist floating over the prairie, a mist rising over the prairie. So if it sunk into the prairie, it would be a mixture. It wouldn't be a mist anymore. So the mist is the image of the incorporeal events that float over things. So you need the whole expression to get that. It's not an optical mist that stops us from seeing things. It's a floating mist. Why over a prairie? Why is it so good to have a mist over a prairie? Why is it so clear? An example when it's over the prairie, but you need the whole expression.
I think it's because the mist itself has so many connotations that he has to use a little bit more poetic license, and I think we all do get the same visual of a mist, like over a prairie, say in an evening or morning, and you have it's not visible, it's not invisible. You can see fairly through it, but it is cloudy-ish, and it is light, and it does sort of have that essence of feeling like there's physicality, but there isn't. I mean, it's a really poetic turn of phrase, but I think it's very intentional because it's sense, as he's talked about here, but also as he gets heavily into difference and repetition, commonly is used as something that is very much a thing, like a dense body that is a thing to be discussed, or it's talked about as this completely, penetrable other side where it's like, completely invisible, whatever, who cares, gaseous. And he's kind of splitting it and saying, no, it's kind of both. And that visual is really nice, I think.
I mean, we might be reading into it too much at this point, but you could also...
Hell yeah, we are.
It almost evokes an idea of like naturalness in this pastoral scene as well, because there's a kind of, again, a Bergsonian concern with sort of, and even when he discusses, Kant and anti-Oedipus and stuff, of, legitimate and illegitimate uses of different processes, right? So like sense, although it has this paradoxical element in expression and the way it emerges in language, it emerges sort of from a natural process. It doesn't have to be correlated to some artificial, like transcendental truth in order to be what it is. It's something that is sort of it's naturalistic, strictly in the sense that it's imminent to this kind of ecology of different factors, I guess, if that isn't Wurtzu, that it's not something that has to be constructed logically and applied externally to things in order for us to understand them, but it's something arising naturally from their articulations, in that Bergsonian sense. I might be going a bit far resonance there.
I need to, I think, start institute something similar to a swear jar, and anyone who says, I think I'm overthinking anything Deleuze or Guattari ever wrote has to put in a quarter or a dollar, because there's a kind of beautiful irony in saying you're overthinking these two. I don't know if it's even possible to overthink these people. So, but I think the other part I want to get into is part of the same paragraph, actually. It's the end of the paragraph where it talks about the impenetrability of all of this. The use of the word impenetrability, they say, is odd. In fact, impenetrability does mean something else. Humpty Dumpty opposes the impassibility of events to the actions and passions of bodies, the non-consumable nature of sense to the edible nature of things. The impenetrability of incorporeal entities without thickness to the mixtures and reciprocal penetrations of substances. In short, the pride of verbs to the complacency of substantives and adjectives. The impenetrability also means the frontier between the two. Wow. So great. Thank you for making me go back to this. This was what I was going to try to get back to, because it's the impenetrability being the frontier between the two. He just finished saying that it's like a mist, but now it's also impenetrable. It's an impenetrable mist.
You ever played Zelda? Come on, man.
That's terrible. That's a bad joke. Bad joke.
No, I think it's just that it's like we talked about the mirror, the two sides of the mirror, or any of the other sort of like imagery that he's used, the Mobius underside of the Mobius strip or something, that it's like the two sides can't touch. There's a kind of converging, but the sense I was getting is they can converge sort of being in the frontier space rather than sort of touching like Michelangelo's atom or something. It's an idea of like it has to be, you have to have that frontier between the series, or else they would be able to collapse onto each other, which I don't think would be possible under Deleuze's framework.
I think also there's he's playing with his Stoic and his Platonic theories. So the mist is the aliquid. That's one figuration of the aliquid, which is a body that's so free of bodily determinations that it figures what an event is, and if I stick to my demarcation of the dualities or the hypotheses, that there are 4 in this chapter. The first, when he talks about the pride of the verbs to the complacency of the substances, that's the Cratylus hypothesis, that the duality is in the 2 different types of names, and impenetrability on that model is on the side of the verbs. But that model is only useful heuristically to get us to see the other model, the 4th model, which is that it's the real duality, or the last word of duality is the duality of 2 dimensions in language, in which case impenetrability is the frontier between the 2 dimensions, the maintaining of the 2 dimensions as separate.
Oh, I like that. See, I understood some things, Terence.
I explained some things.
Yeah, there we go.
I think that's right. I think the impenetrability means that things can't penetrate each other. I think that's what it's referring to. And then it gives that list of things that it gives a list of things that can't penetrate, are impenetrable to each other. So the impenetrative and corporeal entities are thickness to the mixture and reciprocal penetration of substances, etc., etc. And this impenetrability, as Sam says, is the frontier between the two. It's that point between the two, between the example he gives is the mist and the prairie. They're not penetrable to each other. And that goes on. Obviously, we're talking as we go on about the sense of sense that kind of moves into the proposition.
I like that usage because I think it also carries back into the previous paragraph where it talks about bodies being brought to the surface, depriving them of depth, and how that, it's the ideal little girl and the ideal little boy have to disengage themselves from their real voracious gluttonous or blundering images that, again, playing with the idea of that it's not a thing that can necessarily be penetrated. You can't really move across it, that the phantasms of the surface replace the hallucination of the depth when you make this transfer, but it's not that things actually go back and forth. Interesting. I like that. Any last notes or comments? Because I think we are slowing down. We have finished the section, so I'm going to go ahead and slowly end out the recording. If there's any last notes, I'd love to hear any last notes or thoughts. That's wonderful. Thank all of you for joining us. We will be continuing into Series 5 next week. Be watching for a link in the Logic of Sense chat for the Crypt pad, as well as kind of everything. I'm tossing a new PDF up, all of that fun stuff. And again, next Sunday, I will be doing a sort of reading and discussion as I sort of parse my notes. I may do one a little earlier because I've started to have more issues with this reading than I thought I would. And so might annoy most of you at random times to join me or with questions, especially a handful of you, Derek and Terrence. But everyone's welcome to join, without a doubt. So thank you all, and I'm going to go ahead and end the recording. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
This is great. No, thank
you.
Thank all of you for joining, for sure. This is great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.